After 69, you have this extensive new economic policy, pro-Malay policy, so that UMNO can win back the Malay support and lock in their support for every elections to come. And beyond the economic sphere, we have national cultural policy, we have stronger enforcement of national language policy, and so on. So the idea is to make the Malay character of Malaysia more pronounced. And of course, the non-Malays felt resentful, and therefore they would support the Chinese-based opposition party, DAP.
Currently a professor at Sunway University, Dr. Chin-Huat Wong is also the Deputy Head of Strategy for the Asia Headworks of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN, hosted by the university. Sponsored by the Chevening Scholarship, Chin-Huat Wong completed his PhD in electoral and political systems from the University of Essex. A political scientist by training, Dr. Wong has been engaging in Malaysian politics for the last 25 years. He began his career as a political columnist in 1998 and later went on to work for SUCHU, a Chinese community-based reform lobby, as Secretary-Chief. Chin-Huat Wong has played a crucial role in forming the electoral reform lobby, the Coalition for Clean and Fair Elections, and was actively involved until his recent retirement. He also works closely with the free market think tank Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS, based in Malaysia. He joins us today on our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Professor Chin-Huat Wong, welcome to Advocata Conversation. Welcome to Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Murtaza. Please call me just Chin-Huat. Thanks for having me here.
Okay. So Chin-Huat, we would first like to understand your story. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am third generation Malaysians. All my four grandparents came from southern China. They are of an sub-ethnic group called Teochew. And I grew up in a mixed neighborhood. I had more non-Chinese neighbors. I probably know more of them before I went to school, which was in Chinese medium. That gave me the best of both worlds. I learned to appreciate the great heritage of my nation. I do not see the diversity as a challenge, let alone a disadvantage. But at the same time, I had the opportunity to learn about my culture, and from there I developed that empathy and respect for other culture. I went through Chinese medium primary school, state funded, and then went to high school that was still state funded, but we had Chinese as a single language subject. Then I went to National University for my bachelor and master degrees. Our medium of instruction was Malay, the national language, but the textbooks, most of them we have to use English. And in my free time, I write commentaries in Chinese. So I have been trained to think in different languages, to write, and then to translate at any time. And that has become a great advantage for me.
Right. And since you learned in 3 languages, does language have an association with the way you think?
I think to some extent,
Right.
languages are like windows, allow us to see the world from different perspectives. But I don't think it fundamentally shaped us so much, except that certain language would emphasize certain cultural aspect. For example, Malay is a very polite language, very courteous language, in the sense that if I use the word you, I may sound disrespectful. I would have to pick the right word to use, unlike in English, to some extent in Chinese, that I could use rather liberally.
So you went for your undergraduate in University of Malaya?
University of Malaya.
And then what did you do thereafter?
I continued my master about 2 years later at the National University of Malaysia in psychology. My first degree was in economics. In between that time, I wrote political commentary for the Chinese newspaper. which led me to be employed as the Secretariat Chief for perhaps Malaysia's first parliamentary lobby group called SUCHU. So we started making our visits to Parliament, talking to parliamentarians, take notes of what they do. But in that process, we also got attacked by the government at that time under Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad as a public enemy, because at that time he needed to show up his supports amongst the Malay voters. And there's no better way to cast a Chinese-based group as a boogeyman, even though that
This was when?
This was in 2000, year 2000.
Okay. And then you did your master's, and
Yeah.
then are you today a political science professor?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So what got you to get into political science?
I always knew that I like politics.
Right.
But when I first, after my pre-U, the marks allowed me to have a few choices. And at that time, I fell in love with economics.
Right.
And that was sort of a more mainstream choice. But at some point, I knew that I probably would go back to political science.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you speak a lot of politics at home?
Not really. My family was actually, my parents were sundry shop owners, so they don't talk much politics. I'm the most political of my 6 siblings. I'm the youngest.
Okay.
So in many ways, I'm the odd one out.
Okay. So, Chin-Huat, before we get into understanding the real political economy of Malaysia, can you give us some historical context on Malaysia, what its history is, what its colonial period was, and what happened during independence?
Malaysia is a post-colonial country, I think to some extent like Sri Lanka, in the sense that we did not have same government governing all our territory to date before the British.
So when did the British come?
The British first stepped foot in the island of Penang in 1786, 10 years after they were kicked out from the America.
Okay. So it came as a trading post. And did they have the whole country, or they selectively came in?
No, they came in to look for port colonies.
Right.
So they first got Penang, and then later they got Malacca temporary during the Napoleonic War. And at the same time, they found Singapore as their own. So these three constitute what we call the street settlement. And only as late as around 1874, they stepped foot into the inland Malay kingdoms.
So historically, the Malay Peninsula, it was never a unified kingdom.
It was unified to a large extent by the Malaccan Sultanate with that rule across both sides of Malacca Strait.
Right.
So part of Sumatra in Indonesia, the large part of the Malay Peninsula, but not Sabah Sarawak.
Okay. And prior to, when did Islam come to Malaysia?
Islam came to Malaysia perhaps as early as around 13th century.
Okay.
But it became really important in 15th century when the Malaccan sultans adopted Islam as his faith.
So the Malaccan sultans were different to the Thais, because towards the north there was a Siam kingdom, right?
Yes.
So there was a barrier that the Siamese didn't come into the Malay Peninsula.
Well, at the beginning, Malacca was a vassal state to the Thai.
Right.
But with the Chinese protection, it gained that autonomy from Thailand. So Thai were told not to touch Malacca. And Malacca grew to be a maritime power in Southeast Asia.
So when did the Chinese come to Malaysia?
Chinese probably stepped foot as trader as long as 2,000 years ago, but they were very tiny.
Right.
But most Chinese that we have in Malaysia today cannot claim to be descendants of those ancient Chinese.
Right.
If they have left behind any descendants, it's more likely would be the Malays.
So when did the Chinese come to Malaysia?
the bulk of the Chinese came to Malaysia around early and mid 19th century.
Right.
So partly because of the opening of port in Penang and Singapore, but also during that time as the tin mining became more important, the Malay rulers themselves brought in Chinese for mining in Johor, one of the state, for plantation.
So they bought them as workers.
They brought them in as workers, or in some case, they were basically sort of entrepreneur. The Chinese who came with a group, they would work on the mine, a tin mine, or on plantation, and they pay taxes to the Malay rulers.
Okay. And why did they need to bring the Chinese in? Why couldn't the Malays work?
There were different part of that situation. At the beginning, at that time, it was before the British officially stepped foot in. So the Chinese were brought in for tin mining because they had the technology. And in Johor, it was very thinly populated at that time. So they didn't bring in just the Chinese, but also the Javanese from Indonesia and so on. But later on, when the British took over the inland Malay sultanates, they did have a policy to not involve most of the Malays in the modern economic sector. And the reason had to do with India. The 1857 mutiny in India caused the British colonial rulers to have a policy to minimize social disruption. And that incident had far-reaching consequences on Malaysian politics and economy in two ways. One, by keeping most of the Malays out of the modern sectors, the Malays were historically economically backward. And that eventually led to the demand of an affirmative actions, which some other people see it as pure nativism, to give preferential treatments to the Malays and later other native in public sector employment, in business licensing, and in education, later extend to public sector employment, equity ownership, whole ownership, and so on. The second implication is that because the British wanted to rule Malays indirectly, they preserve the Malay states, or even strengthen the Malay states as a political entity, but limited the Sultan's power only to Islam and Malays custom. That led to the identity of Malayness and Islam, which later on, what it meant is that the missionaries, Christian missionaries, were not allowed to convert the Malays, even though they set up many missionary schools. And therefore, all Malays remains as Muslim. And that led the cleavage structure to be both on the ethnic and the religious line at the same time, dividing the Malays and the non-Malays.
And where did the Indians come?
The Indian were brought. The Indian, like the Chinese, they were step foot as early as 2000, and they left behind many cultural imprints on us.
So 2,000 years ago.
2,000 years ago. So the early Malay civilization has very strong Indian influence.
So were they Hindus or?
Both Hindus and later Buddhists.
Buddhists, right.
So for example, our monarchies trace their origins to this idea of Deva Raja.
Okay.
Yeah, the divine king. So of course later when they embraced Islam and all these concepts were Islamized and replaced by Islamic concept. But we do have a strong roots in Indian influence, much like Indonesia. But unlike Indonesia, where they're very comfortable with the Indianization past, Malaysia would like to stress more about Islam, and partly that has to do with our ethnic politics.
Mm-hmm. So, you are familiar with the concept of synchronism.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of these influences in the Islam that is practiced in Malaysia?
Yes, Islam is practiced in many ways, and that we had influences of Islam directly come from Arabs, mainly through Yemen and so on, and also through India. And in the past, I believe I myself I'm not a Muslim, but I believe that our practice of Islam was very inclusive. You have you have elements of Sunnis and Shia practices blending together and so on. That was not an issue as it is now today.
Okay. And so you said that from ancient times the Indians had influence, but when did the mass migration of Indians happen? They came for the plantations? Or?
Yes, they came for plantation, and that's exactly because of the British policy of not to disrupt the social structure in the Malay community. So for plantation, for constructions of railways and routes and so on, they brought in Indians mainly from Tamil Nadu, but also small portions of them as administrators from the north, Punjab, for example.
So, what was the colonial economy like? Was it based on plantations and tin mining?
Yes, it was mainly based on rubber plantation and tin mine, and that's the main part that how it was grown. The capital ownership was very much foreign
business.
Yeah.
So the Chinese basically worked in these enterprises and they had their own private businesses.
Yes, the Chinese were brought in as basically miners, but they came in as sort of sometimes as their own clan, sometimes basically underworld groups. So they work all these things out. Many of them perish in very tough living conditions, but those who survive, many of them make themselves to be millionaires.
Okay. And they were mainly from southern China?
Yes, basically it's from 3 provinces, Fujian, Guangdong, Guangxi, and today part of Guangdong is Hainan, so 4 provinces.
Okay. So the colonial economy was controlled by British interests. And its main role was to provide raw materials for the empire.
Yes.
So during the colonial times, was Malaysia very docile? Was the country very docile? Did they oppose colonial rule?
Colonial rule were opposed at the beginning stage,
right?
For various reasons. Part of it's for economic reason because many of the local chieftains were denied their income. They have to become tax collectors for the British rather than collecting it themselves and give their share to the sultans and so on. So part of it was because of crash of culture and custom, and sometimes for better or for worse. There were instances where the crash was because of British opposition to slavery in some individual cases.
Okay, interesting. So World War II happens, and the Japanese overrun Malaya.
Yes,
and they occupy you for what, 2 years, 3 years?
3 years and 8 months.
Right.
Yeah.
Was it very harsh, very hostile?
It was very harsh, but also it left behind a deep scar on how the Malayan society mainly. What happened was because that the Chinese then, who were not local citizens of naturalized citizens of Malaysia, because there was no Malaysia yet. So they were just overseas Chinese citizens, and they were certainly naturally supporting China. And so the Japanese were very harsh on them.
Because the Japanese were in China, right?
Were in China.
Okay.
They were in China. So that they were very cruel to the Chinese in China, and the Chinese in Malaya, of course, were supportive of their counterpart and their homeland. Okay. And so I'm very lucky to be here because there's a good chance that either of my some of my grandparents could have been killed by them, and I wouldn't be here. And
your grandparents, where did they settle in Malaysia?
They were settled. They settled down in the west coast states of Perak, where you have famous for tin mine.
Okay. So then you have Second World War. The Japanese are there, and then the war ends, and the Japanese leave.
Yes.
So then, what was left?
Go back a little bit to the Japanese occupation. They were using because as what they did in courting the Indian nationalists, the Burmese nationalists, they caught the Malay nationalists and Indonesian nationalists, promising independence eventually. And in that process, many of the Japanese apparatus were run by the Malays. And fighting against the Japanese were guerrillas, mainly consisting of Chinese, backed by the British. So for 2 weeks after the Japanese surrender, there was a vacuum. Before the British returned, this guerrilla, who were mainly communists in leaning, they took over. They purged all those collaborators with Japanese. This was cross-ethnic. But within the Chinese community, it would be seen as just purging against the war, as it happened in many parts in Europe after the war. But for the Malays, they see this as, they saw it, and until today, they see it as ethnically motivated. So it was the Chinese as an outsider group trying to take over, and that left behind this perception that the Chinese could not be led to be in power. They would take control, they would marginalize the Malay, and until today, the term communist is very liberally used against the Chinese. Even those Chinese who are completely from free market, but they put the term communist, they call, for example, the main Chinese party now in government as communist, with that implication that this was the Chinese who would take over and then marginalize the Malay, persecuted the Malay.
So you said there was a 2-week window before the British administration came back. And then you had this communist insurgency that didn't go away, right?
Okay, that 2 weeks was this anti-Japanese army,
right,
AMCJA, that took control. And when the British came back, this army was sort of dispersed, but the communists, as the backbone, retained their influence. The communist insurgency did not happen immediately. It happened in 1948. But between 1946 and 1948, there was an important period that how Malaysian politics was shaped. The British by then, in preparation, after the preparation for decolonizations of the Indian subcontinent, they wanted to merge all their possessions in British Malaya. At that time, there was a street settlements, the port colonies, and then you have a federated Malay states, which has more centralized structure. And then you have another 5 unfederated Malay states. So a whole strings of different possession. They wanted to combine everything to prepare for its eventual decolonization, except for Singapore. Now, what happened then was that this was meant to be a unitary state with liberal citizenship for the non-Malays, the Chinese and the Indians.
So we are now still talking about just after World War II.
After World War II. Right. So for that 2 years, the British tried to push for this idea called Malayan Union. And the Malay was staunchly against it because...
So was it to be a dominion?
It was called to be a crown colony at that time. Was not a dominion yet. To be a crown colony. And because we had, including Singapore, we have 12 states. So 9 of these states were protectorates. To turn it into a colony was certainly an insult to the Malays. But more than that, what they opposed was this idea of citizenships for non-Malays who have been there for at least one generation are born there. So they objected to that, and that gave birth, that objection, the strong opposition to this Malayan Union structure gave birth to Malaysia most powerful party until 2018, the United Malays National Organization, UMNO, which went on to rule the country.
So during this period where the British were trying to create a crown colony, did they promote some kind of representation amongst the Malaysians?
We had not had election yet, but there was towards that direction. But however, the Malayan unions were short-lived because of strong Malay opposition, especially from UMNO, which had influence across the aristocratic class, but as well as some of the British colonial officer. So in 1948, the British rolled back the plan, and the whole Malaya concept was revamped as Federation of Malaya. But in the Malay words, the word Malaya was in Malaya was the land of Malay, Tanah Melayu. And so it acquired the character of an ethnocracy. But what is interesting is that about 4 months after this birth of Federation of Malaya, this federated ethnocracy, the communist insurgency exploded. And the British immediately then realized that it had to sort out the communal issue. Otherwise, it would hand over Malaya to the communists. And the UMNO leadership was then forced to, or encouraged to find a solution. So UMNO later worked together with a Chinese party and an Indian party to form a multi-ethnic coalition called the Alliance.
Okay. And this alliance continues until independence?
Yes. In fact, they were the one who won the independence from the hand of British.
Right.
So the communists played the role of the bad cop, opposing colonial rule.
Right.
And the Alliance was the good cop telling the British and saying, you have to give us independence, otherwise you're strengthening the communists.
So you have India or South Asia gaining independence in 1947, 1948.
Yes.
And Malaysia gets independence in 1957.
57.
So there was a 10-year period.
Yeah.
Why was this not hastened? What delayed the whole process?
Well, partly because that the political development was not as advanced as in South Asia.
Okay.
Yeah. And we have Malay parties or Malayan parties coming out during that time. But for example, we had no solution. So it was partly because of the communist insurgency that forced the Malay parties to work with the non-Malay parties. So everyone agreed and say, well, we want to get independence and we do not want the country to be a communist, so you have to work things out. So what we had then that was characterized or mischaracterized as consociational democracy.
So 1957 comes and then you become independent from the British.
Yes.
So what we know as Malaysia, what was that composed of?
Malaysia was formed in 1963.
Right.
Other than Malaya, it included Singapore,
right,
which gained its autonomous status in 1959, and Sabah and Sarawak remains crown colonies with no self-government until then. The Singaporeans, under the leadership of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, wanted a merger or remerger with Malaya because they could see it would be very hard for the island to survive on its own. They need an economic hinterland.
So Malaya gets independence 57, and Singapore remains a crown colony.
Remained a crown colony, but it became autonomous by 1959.
Okay. And then Sabah and Sarawak, were they Malay kingdoms or what were they before?
They were part of nominally territories, colonial territories, colonies of Brunei and Brunei Sultanate and the Sulu Sultanate in the Philippines.
But geographically, if you look at these regions,
Yeah.
how come they didn't go with Indonesia?
Well, because Sarawak were taken over by a white British family
Right.
called the Brookes.
Okay.
So they became the White Raja.
Okay.
And Sabah was a property of British North Borneo companies, like a chartered company like the East India Company.
Okay. So what were they doing there? They were taking timber or rubber or palm oil?
There's no palm oil then, so it's mainly agriculture and then some minings and so on. And petroleum came later.
Yeah. So all these entities are then merged together in 1963 as Malaysia.
Yeah. Yes.
And then this goes on till 1965.
Yeah.
And then Singapore is kicked out.
Yes.
Right. And then you're left with Malaysia.
Yes. So we have 3 changes of international boundary.
Right. So let us know what the environment was like after independence. What were the politics like? Or what was the national, narrative, the debate?
Well, when in 1955, Malaya had its first national election. At that time, the alliance won 51 out of 52 seats with over, I think, 80% of votes, because at the time we had no opposition. But immediately after elections, it's impossible for the parties not to have rivals. And the rivals came from both sides. From the Malay side, you have the Pan-Malayan Islamic Party, PAS. And then from the non-Malay, especially the Chinese side, you have central-left parties to Socialist Party. So they oppose the government. Both the opposition oppose the governments on both class issue, but also this is where they would agree with each other to some extent, but also opposingly on identity issues, especially at the time was language.
Okay, so that was, and during the time of independence, do you remember what the demographic structure was? What proportion was Malay, Chinese, Indian?
That at that time, Malay and non-Malays were very close. The reason why Singapore was excluded is if you add in that island, which was predominantly Chinese, the non-Malays would overtake Malay.
Okay. So is that the main reason why they were booted out?
Partly, because when they were taken in, the reason why we had Sabah and Sarawak was to balance up Singapore. So in the federal parliament, Singapore was deliberately underrepresented, but Sabah and Sarawak overrepresented. But why it caused this union to be short-lived was the Malayan federal government wanted to have a control on the new states. In Sabah and Sarawak, they managed to bring together the new local parties as their local versions of alliance. But in Singapore, you already have this People Action Party. And so there was a clash right at the start. And later on, PAP wanted to join the alliance in Malaya and say, let us replace the Chinese party. We would be able to provide you a stronger basis for the non-Malays. And this was rejected because it was seen as, the Singaporean was seen as too aggressive. And when they were rejected, they say, now let us form a coalition of opposition to take you on. And the Malayas say, enough is enough, we cut you off. So instead of allowing that to become a two-party system, which may not be very healthy, what you see is a separation that produced two one-party states.
Okay.
So both sides of the divide, we became one-party state.
So you were saying that Singapore was underrepresented. So it's a first past the post system. It was a Westminster style system.
Yes, but the allocations of seats were not proportionally determined.
Okay.
So at that time, Malaya has 104. And Singapore was only given 15 seats, while Sabah and Sarawak together had 40 seats.
Wow. And they had very small populations, right?
No, the populations of Singapore actually is larger than both states combined.
Okay.
So that the representation in the federal parliament was reversed. to make sure that Singapore would not have an very powerful say. But in action, Singapore has got more these devolved powers. So they control their own education, healthcare, and labor.
So the federal Malaysia is a federal state.
Yes.
And what level of delegation is there in the power structure in Malaysia?
What level?
So at the state level, what level of subsidiarity is there?
All right. Okay. We have nominally 3 levels of government.
Right.
We have 13 states and 3 federal territories, like the Union territories in India. Then underneath that, we have districts. In Sabah and Sarawak, they have divisions. But in practice, after 1965, we no longer have local government elections. So whoever controls the state, they control the local elections. We are 2-tier instead of 3. And
so there is no local government.
There's local governments, but all appointed by the state government. So basically, the state election is buy one get one free.
Okay.
You pick the ruling party for state, and the ruling party pick the local government for you. And in the federal territory, they have completely no state level election. You pick the federal government, they give you the federal territory government.
So you have a FPP system.
First possible, yes.
Right. Okay. And so the Malays basically, how did they start dominating the parliament? Do they have more seats than the proportion of the number of Malays?
Yes, because that our constituencies were drawn with this built-in advantage.
So they didn't have a delineation process?
We have, but that process has not, the constitutional provisions were not very tightly defined and then very loosely implemented. Our constitution say since 1973, constituency within the same state have to have approximately equal numbers of electors. Before 73, there was a clause that say the largest cannot be more than twice the smallest. So you have maximum to minimum ratios of 2 to 1. 2 is the maximum, approximately equal to 1. After 73, this clause was taken out. And today, in one of the worst example, the largest constituency in Malaysia has around 300,000 voters. Within the same state, the smallest constituency has only 50,000. So you have 6 to 1. Now, in the past, this has been seen as merely disadvantaging the non-Malays because there was a clear pattern that they would overrepresent the rural area and underrepresents the urban. However, this is no longer the case because of employment and education opportunities are abundant in urban area. You have migrations from rural to urban. And what it means is that Malay become more urban than in the past. And urban area also become more Malays. So today, when we talk about that constituency of 300,000 and 50,000, what we are seeing is not just about the non-Malays being discriminated, but younger Malay. For example, if you have a girl coming from this tiny constituency called Sabak Benam, she got into the university, one of the top university in this large constituency. She transferred her voter registration. Her political power would shrink by 83%. And so this is a good thing in the sense that we have a chance to change all this. Because what you are seeing, the injustice no longer just cut on one fault line, on the ethnic or religious fault line, but they cut across now generational fault line.
So explain to me that you said that you have constituencies that are not equal in numbers.
Yes.
So how did they use the delineation process to kind of favor the Malays? So how did they kind of, so if you are clustered together,
Yeah.
then at least those constituencies, the ethnic groups can dominate, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we do have concentrations of ethnic groups at state level.
Right.
But when you come down to local level, you can see clearer patterns of certain townships predominantly Malay, others were Chinese and so on. So technically they can draw that. But it's important to see both malapportionment of the constituency and the gerrymandering were not entirely on ethnic ground. It was actually more on partisan ground. So, for example, after 1998, when Anwar Ibrahim, the then Deputy Prime Minister, was purged and caused half of the Malays to desert UMNO. In the following round of delimitations of this constituency, the government deliberately created a lot of ethnically mixed constituency. Because in that election, just before the delimitation, the non-Malays were not supporting the opposition. Reason being that they were not sure that toppling the government would cause an anti-Chinese riot, because that just happened in Indonesia in 1998. So looking at the election outcome from 1999, the government decided to draw more multi-ethnic constituency because they think that that's safer. It would protect the government from Malay opposition. But when 9 years later, in 2008, when the ground changed, all this multi-ethnic constituency became opposition territory.
They keep changing the rules of the game to suit the incumbent government. So explain to us, you talked about identity politics.
Yes.
How does identity politics work in Malaysia? Starting with the initial Bumiputra policies, when did they come around and what exactly were they?
Well, it started right even during colonial time for a good reason. Because the Malays were kept out from modern sector, they disappear from the urban area. Therefore, you have these ideas of creating Malay reserve land in prime area in town. And that require a definition. Who are the Malays? As if like in America, you have Indian reserve, then you have to define who are the Indians. And that led to the official definitions of Malay as an ethnic group in the state constitution, eventually migrated to the federal constitution. And at the time when Malaya gained independence, when we had this, what we call Merdeka or Independence Bargain, that bargain came at least on three parts. One, that the non-Malays, most of the non-Malays, like my parents, were granted citizenship. But in return, they accept that, say, the Malays would be given a special position in public sector employment. Civil servant would be majority Malay, in education, in business licensing. But all these were not extensive. There's still room for non-Malays. It's just that to help the Malays who were underrepresented in other way. However, in 1969, an ethnic riot happened after elections. And this has to do with first past the post, not because that the first past the post discriminated anyone, but because of one problematic nature of first past the post. Election outcome can be simply unpredictable. In 1964, that was after formations of Malaysia, Indonesia were against us. And the non-Malay opposition parties were split between those who were more left-leaning, hard left, supporting or sympathetic to Indonesia, and those who were with Singapore, with Malaya, who wanted a new country. So the opposition, Chinese-based, non-Malay-based opposition, was split. they got around 25% of votes, but only around, I think, around 6-7% of seats. In 1969, the non-Malay oppositions learned their lessons, so they decide to make sure that they have they nominated one single candidate in one constituency. They pooled their votes together, so they did very well, with almost no change in the total percentage of electorate. They multiplied their seats gain by 4 times, while the Malay opposition made a substantial gains, about 10% of votes from the Peninsular Malaysia. But their seats increased only from 9 to 12, but the non-Malays from 6 to 25. So the other one was only 9 to 12. So that got an impression that this was mainly a non-Malay political reward against power sharing with the Malays. And there was a victory parade by the oppositions. All this prepared the ground for a riot, because people were not sure where this country is going for. And after that riot, UMNO seized the opportunity to redraw the rules of the game, because the 1969 election was very much a Malay tsunami, even though it was not well known by ordinary people. We knew that because we look back at the number, but I'm quite sure the politicians knew it because they lost the Malay support. So that the riot was explained as an outcome of relative deprivation. The Malays feel deprived, therefore we need to help them more, otherwise this country would not.
So you mentioned that there was a tsunami by the Malays, so that means they voted against the incumbency.
Yes.
And what prompted them to do that?
Because they expected the government to be much more interventionist.
Okay.
But the early Malay government were very much pro-Western. They were laissez-faire in economics policy. So the Malays feel like independence did not give us much. Looking back at the number, I could tell that perhaps most of the votes that went to the opposition were new voters. So it was young voters who moved towards that.
So during that period, what has unfortunately impacted Sri Lanka was, some of the more educated people who ran our countries in the 1950s, 60s, they were romanticized with socialism.
Okay.
Was that Fabianism, socialism also there in Malaysia?
Yes, but these were with the leftist party.
Right.
So some of them who went to become closer to the Communist Party, but the others remain as just central left. And
okay. So these riots happened in 1960s.
69.
And then you had the identity politics. And how did it start changing? And also, for the benefit of our viewers, explain how Mahathir came about.
Okay. After 69, you have this extensive new economic policy, pro-Malay policy, so that UMNO can win back the Malay support and lock in their support for every elections to come. And beyond the economic sphere, we have national cultural policy, we have stronger enforcement of national language policy, and so on. So the idea is to make the Malay character of Malaysia more pronounced. And of course, the non-Malays felt resentful, and therefore they would support the Chinese-based opposition party, DAP, which today become the main Chinese party in the government. And they were the non-Malays were split between whether to support the opposition or the Chinese parties or the non-Malay parties, the government, because you need some representation. But at the same time, you knew that the system was set against you. So there was always this pendulum effect between them. But what is more interesting is on the Malay ground. After the riot, UMNO tried to bring all parties together, except DAP and a regional party. Everyone, including PAS, for a moment was in this grand coalition called National Front, Barisan Nasional. But these two Malay parties could not last for long because the first past the post system does not build in a primary mechanism. So when you have two parties competing for the same ground, the conflicts were bound to explode at some point. And so these two parties broke apart. The Malay Nationalist Party, which was then, you could say, somewhat secular modernist, and then PAS was more traditional and eventually become full-brown Islamists. And by that time, because we have NEP, the economic policy, we have emphasized much more on Malay language, which of course changed the landscape in employment and so on. Language became less important. The Malay parties no longer compete over language because both parties would say, yes, we want to support Malay language, and they compete over Islam. So over time, the Malay parties is PAS, even though PAS did not win seats, sizable seats, until many years later, PAS managed to pull UMNO moving to the right.
So when you say that the two parties would compete on Islam, is it that they were trying to make it more fundamentalist, or what exactly was the competition on Islam about?
Well, it's a question that the older UMNO elites were Anglicized aristocrats.
Right.
So they're very much like the Anglicized elites in South Asia.
The brown sahibs.
Yes, in South Asia and so on. And but the younger generations, you talk about Mahathir Mohamad, he was our first prime minister not educated in the UK.
Right.
Not a lawyer. So someone came from a different background, someone who felt that they had been wrong by the British colonialists and then slighted by the Chinese and the Malays. He himself was half Kararan.
Yes, that's what I heard.
Yeah. So
and around that time, amongst the Malays, is there also a class struggle between the elite aristocrats and the more working?
Not much. The reason being that the leftist Malay party have been crushed by them.
Okay.
So PAS was supposed to be more grassroots based,
right?
Less elitist and so on. Right. So PAS was the counter elite party, if you like, but because that it emphasized so much on Islam, so that cleavage was much more on identity than on class. Or I could say that it's a fusion of both. Underneath the undercurrent may be economics, but on the surface is much more ideological.
So
identity.
You keep saying that they were focusing on Islam.
Yeah.
So what exactly were they focusing on? On the fundamental nature of the religion? No.
PAS by early 80s wanted to have Sharia law as a basis of the country.
Okay.
They want implementations. They want to Islamize the society using the states. It would be wrong to characterize it, as many in Malaysia do, as Talibanization. It's not. What PAS want is somehow based on Ottoman, but in a much more restrictive fashion. You think of it somewhere between Ottoman and Wahhabi.
So the independence constitution, was it secular?
Huh?
Was the independence constitution?
It was secular. At least for people like me, I believe that it's secular. But it was not framed in unambiguous language. Because what we have is Islam is the religion of the federation. Because the states have Islam, the Malay states already have Islam as a state religion. So this is to cover the entire federation. But it was meant more for ceremonial purposes. It's like Anglicanism in the UK. Right. But later on, the Islamists claim and say no, because this is Article 3, that Islam is the religion of the federation, then it has to be given prominence. It's no longer just as the religious or cultural basis of a secular society, but rather they want it to be the driving force, the central pillar of of how our nationhood should be. So back to what the government did in response to past competition. The government came out with Islamization on the other path, for example, Islamic finance. That was introduced by Anwar Ibrahim when he was brought in as the government answer to past. So we have International Islamic University, we have all these indoctrinations of Islamic values in administrations and so on. It was softer than the opposition one, but they were not fundamentally opposing each other.
So we talked about syncretism.
Yeah.
So the Malay culture has yet been preserved. So Islam and the Malay culture are coexisting?
Yes, but in the past that you would have many things that had the roots of from Indian civilizations, from Hinduism or Buddhism, preserved or tolerated as much as you find in Indonesia. But today, there's a conscious and active process to cleanse Malay culture from all those pre-Islamic influences.
Okay.
For example, we have a very famous art form, what we call wayang kulit. This play using shadow.
Puppet,
right. Yes. And all those traditional shows have a lot of things going back to Ramayana and so on. And it was effectively banned in the state where it was most famous for, Kelantan.
Wow, what a pity.
Yes.
In my few visits to Malaysia, I have seen one of those shows.
Yeah.
Of course, this was some time ago. So, going back to Mahathir,
yeah.
So he comes, he's a disruptor. And on what platform does he come to power?
He came through UMNO.
Right.
He was a staunch critic of the first Prime Minister.
Right.
Tunku Abdul Rahman, a prince, laid-back, easygoing prince, whom Mahathir criticized as abandoning the Malays. So he came as an ultra-nationalist. He was kicked out from his party and then came back later and then rose to the top. It would be wrong or oversimplify to see him as just a disruptor. He's as much as disruptor, also a constructor. He met the aspirations of many Malaysians to be known internationally. So not just a Malay nationalist, but also a Malaysian nationalist. But his form of nationalism is not based on democracy. He doesn't believe that, I think he fundamentally doesn't believe that everyone is politically equal. Not just talking about ethnic line, but this contempt that the ordinary people can be equal and make decisions, and they can be trusted to decide how the country should be run. So he is inherently
he's authoritarian, he's illiberal.
Yes.
The illiberal authoritarian.
Yes.
But nevertheless, he does a good job, right? I mean, he really develops the country.
Exactly. That's the part that what we really need to recognize. It's very complex. I believe if Mahathir were to be a British politician, he would be someone perhaps close to Margaret Thatcher.
Okay.
Right? He'll be very effective, shrewd, but still democratic. But facing a society like Malaysia, he has no pretense to be in any way democratic.
Right. So he comes on this ethnic platform. He's authoritarian.
Yeah.
He's illiberal.
Yeah.
But he develops the country. So
Yes.
does he promote further identity politics whilst he's there?
He was actually very pragmatic. When he first came into power, his slogans was Bersih, cakap amanah, clean, efficient, and trustworthy. So he was actually talking about reform, trying to make Malaysia much more dynamic as compared to the previous government. And at the time when he was challenged by his own party rival in late 1980s, he played up the ethnic club. But when he survived that, immediately he launched liberalizations, opened up the higher education sector. That's the reason why we have many private universities today. He did all these things, talk about a Malaysian nation for a while, until Anwar fell out with him. When Anwar challenged him during this East Asian economic crisis, then he played up the ethnic card again. So he is a politician capable of whatever script that is necessary for his survival.
So, Chin-Huat, you did say that you studied economics.
Yeah.
Explain to me the economic policies that Mahathir followed.
Mahathir basically, his policy is one of state capitalism. So he believed in market force driven by the state. During his time, he privatized a lot of state enterprises, but not to promote competitions as what you see under Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan and so on. This was basically from public monopoly to become private monopoly.
So he had a lot of crony businessmen, right?
Yes. But if you compare him to, say, Najib, the last prime minister from BN before his ouster, Najib's cronyism was unproductive because very much speculative. And Mahathir would pride himself and say that his cronyism was productive because he did bring about economic development. It's just that a big chunk of that undeservingly went to the pocket of his crony, but they still deliver.
Right. Yeah. So it was pro-trade. It was free market, pro-trade.
Yeah.
Malaysia was open to trade, right?
Yes.
And it also attracted a lot of FDI, a lot of factors.
Yes. We were very pragmatic on all this ground.
Right.
So, for example, that we may be taking an anti-Western stand on geopolitics and so on, but when it comes to trades, we are very pragmatic.
And then he also permitted the Chinese entrepreneurs to really prosper.
Well, I would put it this way, that I think that he had, being a pragmatic politician, he wanted the country to grow. He picked his crony. And he is not a race. It's not a genuine or inherent racist, as many like to believe him to be. It's not. He's just a pragmatic man. So when he needs to, when the circumstances is profitable for him to be racist, he would sing all those tunes as he is doing now. But in other time, he is very pragmatic. He appreciates smart people. So therefore, it's not surprising that among those crony businessmen he promoted, many of them were non-Malays.
So for him to do this dramatic transformation of Malaysia, he would have had very capable lieutenants, would have also had very capable civil servants. So how did the government apparatus work during that time?
Well, you would say that, I think there are two changes, that he emphasized more on the private sector. So you see a stronger business influence to the government. But on the other hand, the old British trained civil service faded into the picture. So we in the older days, you would see more honest, upright civil servants that probably were more compromised later. But also at the same time, you see people who are much more aggressive because they were enterprising, if you like, on the other hand. So society moved on, but our prosperity came with a huge price on our institutions. We used to have a judiciary that was respected throughout the Commonwealth. That was almost destroyed during his time. And it took us one generation time to slowly build it back.
So Malaysia had these Bumiputra policies, which necessitated a business run by a non-Malay to have a Malay partner?
Yes.
But they were called sleeping partners, right? So how does that work?
Well, because that sometimes what happened is that you could have Malay businesses being the main contractor, and then they have non-Malays as subcontractor.
Okay.
So basically rent seeking. But we have to look at the picture as a whole. We do have many smart, enterprising Malay entrepreneurs, but these people may not themselves be the one who got the best government contracts, because it was based on cronies.
Okay.
When cronyism operates, so you have more people, all these businesses went to the cronies who then look for their own cronies. And that's why it makes our development much more costly. We could have done more without all this. But that come back to the whole questions of political competitions. We can't talk about free market unless you have the incentive right in the political market. And as long as we have democracy, we have multi-party competitions, parties and politicians would have to have product differentiation. They have to be different from their rival to attract votes. And that come back to say, basically 3 types of differences. The easiest is identity politics. You argue about who's got to be more powerful, whose ancestor came to this country first, but those are completely unproductive because it doesn't solve our problem now. The second one is just merely patronage. If someone who get into power, who can dish out more money in one way or another, that may even mellow identity politics, but it itself is very costly because we would end up with about a burgeoning state with heavy debt, with corruptions, mismanagements of resources. And the third thing, that if we want to move away from identity politics and patronage politics, we need politics that is based on policy differences. Whether it's left, right, whatever direction, is more pro-environment or pro-development, we need politicians to debate about that. But unfortunately, Malaysia is prevented from seeing such optimum competition.
Because the rules of the game have different incentives, the wrong incentives?
Yes, also because that our system is fundamentally majoritarian.
Right.
With a divided society, when you have a majoritarian system, those who already control power, the majority groups, have a strong sense of fear of losing everything if they're not united, right? That reinforces identity politics. On the other hand, the minorities were forced to be wanting to team up with the government instead of offering their own competitions. Or otherwise, if they stand their ground, they may be very radical. So you do not have competitions where rival groups with comparable strengths coexist and challenge each other. So for me, what happened after the ouster of UMNO is a good thing, even though we have not seen the benign competitions of 2 multi-ethnic coalitions. What we have seen so far is always a multi-ethnic groups, whether in government or in opposition, and then you have another, on the other side, a mono-ethnic one. This is bad, but I see in these challenging situations, we have the opportunity for Malaysian politics to move away from majoritarianism.
So, up to 1997, Malaysia was a spectacular success story.
Yes.
And then you had the Asian financial crisis.
Yes.
Of course, it didn't falter as bad as, say, Indonesia or Thailand, because you never had to go to the IMF.
Yeah.
You had enough reserves.
Yeah.
But ever since that, the real hyper growth that you enjoyed has never come back, right? Structural transformation never. It came to you got into the middle income trap.
Yes.
What's going on, and how is the political system influencing this transformation? That is it inhibiting Malaysia going to the next plane?
Yes. The reason why we get caught in this middle income trap partly was China getting into WTO. So China drove away a lot of FDI. So in the past, what could have come in ample supply to offset all our problems, no longer there.
And particularly because you have a big export sector, right?
Yes. But also internally, we did something stupid, not as big as a challenge to what happened in China to us, as that we have a monopolizations of the banking sector.
Okay.
We merged a lot of the banks, and that prevented small, medium enterprises from getting easy liquidity. That stopped them from going further. But overall, I would say, also because we are stuck somewhere, because we were good enough to maintain the situations, not desperate enough for us to push ourselves to go very far.
So show us the linkage between the political system and how it is inhibiting this transformation.
Well, if we have a proper democracy based on policy differences, the parties today in Malaysia would argue about what kind of policy that brings our country further, instead of arguing that dress code or how different religious festivals should be regulated, whether concerts should be allowed, and so on. We spend a lot of time on all those culture war because that's excite people more effectively instead of mundane technocratic issues. But for the country to move forward, we really have to make all those important issues interesting and not make the interesting culture war issues important. So it's a whole question of how to move from there. To move from there, we basically need the parties to recognize that everyone is legitimate stakeholder of the country. The main party have to accept that we would have to come into power. We probably have to share power with each other at some point. And therefore, while we have to emphasize the differences between us in election so that all of us can draw votes, we cannot push that differences too far to the extent that after election we cannot work together. And that's the problem, because our politics have been so majoritarian. Everyone in government try to marginalize the opposition. Everyone in opposition try to delegitimize the government, seeing it as evil. It doesn't help us from competing in a professional manner. So for Malaysian politics to move forward, I would set the bar maybe rather pragmatically low. If our politics can be as good as sports, things would have been better. Because what you need are for politicians to compete with each other professionally, to talk about issues and to accept election outcome, to work hard to win the next election, rather than pulling each other legs during between elections. We need to change all these incentives. We need to embrace politics in a healthy manner. You talk about Advocata Institutes is educating the youth so that they can bring about changes. In some sense, that's what we need in Malaysia. You talk to Malaysians, you ask them and say, do you think that politics is dirty? Most people would say yes. Dangerous? Yes. Difficult? Yes. But what it means is that when you think about politics as dirty, dangerous, and difficult, this is basically a treaty job. Subconsciously, you say, this is a job that we should outsource to some cheap foreign workers. And how can we expect the country to move forward? We can't. So we have to make politics safe, clean, easy to understand. We have to reverse the treaty so people can get into politics. And what it means is that ordinary people should acquire the skill to politically mobilize and also make compromises.
When you were speaking, I was thinking of the saying that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I was thinking of my own country and many of the issues that you just now spoke about. Similarly, that the average people have given up on politics, but it is politics that make change possible. And there's a very good book by Michael Porter on politics. He was a famous strategy guru, and he analyzed American politics. He had a clinical analysis of, he says, it's a wrong type of competition, which is what you are also alluding to. If I could move towards a conclusion now, how would you fix the problem?
I would say change the electoral system.
Okay.
Introduce a party list component, which is interesting if you compare with Sri Lanka. You move very fast from first past the post to a party list, and it has a different dynamics. We wouldn't be able to survive that kind of dramatic changes, but it's important for us to have party lists for two reasons. One, when you have party lists, it will be very hard, a party list component, even just like Thailand, a mixed member majoritarian, not a mixed member proportionals like in Germany or in New Zealand. Even with an MMM system, it would be very difficult for us to have a simple majority government. Political parties would then have to accept that they have to strike some compromises after election to be in power. That would cause them to restrain during election campaign. And once politicians do not preach to their hardcore supporter that people on the other sides are evil, democracy would be possible.
So in most of the electorates in Malaysia under the FPP, do they get 50%?
Not in the last 2-3 elections.
Okay.
Because when it's split out, so you do have about 40% of winners are plurality winners.
So we spoke about what the US is trying, rank preference voting. You don't think that will encourage a middle ground?
No, in Malaysia it will be counterproductive, because if you have a preferential voting system, meaning that the voters can rank candidates with first, second, third choice and so on, it would be very easy for the nationalists to manipulate. Because what would they say is like, it would be, say, for example, for the Muslim nationalists, vote Muslim first. So you pick all the Muslim nationalists. And then the minority would say, for that reason, we have to vote our people first. So then you produce constituency that would just generate parliamentarians who get support from one group and the other. There's no incentive for them to come back. The second reason why I think a mixed member system is important for Malaysia is then we would have the chance of some non-communal based party that cut across the divide, because they come from a different dimensions other than all these economic, cultural issues, which somehow can be.
So what you're advocating is a mix of FPP and proportional representation.
A mix of FPP and proportional representation.
And would you advocate two votes? So you vote one for the FPP, which is your local candidate, and the second for the PR, or you have one vote?
Two votes.
Two votes.
Two votes is important,
so parallel
that you can
voting.
Split them. And also, only with two votes, you get the chance for some small party to get into parliament. We need parties to talk about environmental issue, to talk about generational issue, to talk about gender issue, to talk about class. When we have all these things cutting across, then the ethnic divide would not be so salient as it is today.
So your system, do you think that it doesn't attract the best and the brightest to run for office?
No. We do have smart people going in, but often they cannot get out to the top. And that's part of the first past the post problem. Because in Malaysia, first past the post leads to permanent collation. And therefore, every party cannot contest in all the seats they want to. that leads to the party negotiating what seats they contest, and party president then decide candidates. So it becomes very difficult for someone who is bright and young, going to party, hoping to run in a good seats. Another person support the right faction leader. So you spend so much
the
time.
party leader decides
Yes.
who the list is, who's going to represent which electorate.
Yes.
There is no system of primaries.
No, there's no primary mainly because that we have this permanent coalition.
Okay.
It primarily becomes ineffective.
Okay. So are you optimistic that this can be fixed?
To some extent, yes, because I think ultimately, for all the complex situation we are talking about, it boils down to two things. Can we get it boils down to, there are two types of people, especially for politicians, gamblers or insurance buyers. If people like to believe their luck is good, they will be continually gambling.
Okay.
But if they believe their luck may be bad, they start buying insurance. For democracy to be sustainable and stable, we need more people to buy insurance than those who gamble. And with what happened now, when things become so uncertain, I believe politicians would learn from these circumstances that they should buy insurance.
Okay. And, Lee Kuan Yew famously said about Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan elections is auction on non-existing resources. So do your politicians also promise all kinds of freebies?
Yes.
They do?
Yes. Unfortunately, we have so much in similarity.
Okay. So what brought you to Sri Lanka?
I was invited by the University of Peradeniya to give a keynote in their postgraduate institute research congress to share about Malaysian experience in democratization, identity politics, and majoritarianism.
And you did take a detour. Tell us a bit about your detour.
After Kandy, I went to Jaffna, and what I would say is that Sri Lanka is a very complex society. I'm still trying to learn more about how the society evolved, because from what I have learned, Sri Lanka has had a much more stronger inclinations to political violence and so on in many ways. But at the same time, when I look at Sri Lanka at a discursive level, Sri Lanka is actually much more open. It would be very hard for me to imagine, to see in my eyes that you see the trilingual signs everywhere from airport to government offices and so on. I know that the trilingualism is not practiced in full force, but the fact that this is actually this remains legitimate in the public discourse is something amazing. Because in Malaysian context, while we are very restrained in resorting to political violence, our narratives are much more exclusivist.
Okay. On that note, Professor Chin-Huat Wong, it has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great honor. Thank you.